Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and state of emergency, this meeting is being held by a live video teleconference pursuant to 2020 Senate Bill 150 and in accordance with KRS 61826 because it's not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. Thank you.
Craig, do we need to approve minutes from our last meeting?
You do. You have minutes from June 9th, last week's meeting in your packet.
Right. Has everybody had time to look at those, and anybody have any questions or concerns? And if not, do I hear a move to approve?
So move, man.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All righty. Craig?
Thank you. The second item on your agenda today is really an open discussion item. As you'll recall at your last meeting, we were a little short on time to get through the agenda. And so we have an additional discussion regarding the draft existing conditions and growth trends report on there. Mark, I don't know if you had any introductory comments on that, or if we're good to just open that up to the task force members to start with.
No, we received Vice Mayor Kay's edits for the introduction. Other than that, I hadn't received any draft comments, so I'm ready to hear any comments you have verbally now.
Excuse me a second, Craig. Can you all hear Lynn Phillips?
No.
No. Okay. Oh, she's trying to connect with us.
Then I see Amanda, I believe you've got your hands up.
Thank you. I meant to email this to you, Mark, but I did not. On page 88 for the public safety information, it says in there that Lexington does not have recommendations on police and fire response times. I'm pretty sure fire does. I was just curious if you got that from after talking to anybody internally or just on websites.
I think I agree with you. I think we do have that information. I think that was probably just poorly worded. I think the implication was that they would be increased, like the location of fire stations and police would be reevaluated as development occurs, regardless of any particular build-out scenario. But we can try to get those response times in the report,
or at least just we have them. I mean, I know the fire department has a very high A ranking because of our response times and because of the locations to certain density populations. And I know police may not have those in specifics, but we're doing a lot of that work now on moving some locations around. So I just went with the report to come out and give the indication that we don't have standards that we're trying to measure.
Sure.
So if I can word it a little differently, that might be.
Absolutely.
I'll stop there. That was just the first question I had.
Lynn, are you able to?
Yes. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay, okay. I have some editorial comments to the draft report, but Mark, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to just be able to email them to you directly. I've been out of town, and yeah, I can just email them directly if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. Great.
Great. Thanks.
Any other questions at this point?
I was waiting for other folks, but if nobody else wants to weigh in, let me explain the proposed edits that I sent and the reasoning for it. I wasn't sure what the procedure was going to be today in terms of looking at specific proposals for editing, but my edits all had to do with the first couple of pages, the executive summary, and I don't know what the easiest way to do this is.
I can show them on my screen if you'd like.
If you would.
Sure.
Yeah, I've got mine up, but I've had trouble with that before. Okay. So the main intent of my edits was to make sure that people understood where this report fits in the overall task of this committee. So my suggestion in the third line is to add, if any, where it's about fundamental debate over what criteria and indicators, and I added, if any, would be sufficient to demonstrate the need for expansion. Simply to make it clear that that set of criteria and indicators is not the only thing that we'd be looking at when we're considering a question of expansion. And then I would, at the end of that paragraph, my suggestion is to take out the language that says, well, I don't know what is talk about inserts or out, but basically take out the last part of that sentence, which calls for the creation of a new process for determining long-term land use decisions. That references the section in the comp plan. My recommendation is to insert the entire goal language and subsections A and B in that goal section, which basically lay out what the more complete requirement is for creating this process. And then going further down on that same page, add before, there's a paragraph that begins the existing conditions and growth trends report, identifies the foundational data. And I recommend adding at the first part of that paragraph to address the first part of that process. Again, to be clear that it's not just about analyzing what the growth trends are within the urban service boundary. That's not the only consideration. And then finally, on the next page, on page 2, there is a statement, understanding vacant and underutilized land within the USB, along with projected demands and financial impacts. The language now is are the key elements. And I recommend changing that to our one set of key elements for making decisions about expansion. So they're all aimed at the same notion. So those are my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Very good points. Is everybody comfortable with those changes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Are there any other comments relating to existing conditions and growth trend reports? Any other discussion want to be had before we move on to the framework for evaluation matrix?
I was trying to find it in the shift share analysis, and now I'm having a hard time. I just was curious if we could walk through that analysis a little bit one more time. Mark, would that be okay? Just to understand that a little bit better. I think I was confused when I read it, and then maybe more confused when we walked through
Sure,
it.
let me pull it up on the screen. And Andrew Fain is here. He's from MXD, and maybe he would be willing to go over that. Are you there, Andrew?
Yes, I am, Mark.
Okay, let me pull it up. So sorry, this is a little. This starts with the location quotient, and then it moves to shift share. So I guess it's really kind of combined. So Andrew, if you want to just let me know if you need me to move anything.
Sure. I don't see it up on the screen, Mark.
Oh, that's a problem. There we go.
Okay.
And I can try to let me zoom in, I guess. So that's that page, and I can shift over to the other page. Just tell me how you want me to do it, Andrew.
If you want to go to your right, on the right side, that probably the table there is
Okay.
probably the easiest one to go about. talking. So, well, this is the LQ. I think on the next page, Mark, is the shift share, I believe. Yeah,
There you
that's
go.
it right there. So generally what it is, it's an indicator in terms of regional shifts for this, looking at Fayette County, of how using US Census data and growth. And unfortunately, the census data wasn't out for the most recent years. Obviously, that'll be updated very soon, but I believe it's between 2007 and 2017, if I'm correct. And looking at how Fayette County, the share of jobs has changed over time in that 10-year period compared to the US average. So you can see that there's the national share as well in terms of various employment. So ultimately, all the inputs that you see are in those columns there, but ultimately you're looking at the very right side there and looking at the types of jobs that have either grown or shrank, but not in terms of the number of jobs, but really it's looking at the share compared to the national average is the big thing that you're really looking at. So has Fayette County kept up with the national average of growth for certain industry sectors? So that's the big thing that we're summarizing here. So say for administration support, educational services, healthcare and social assistance, construction, transportation, warehousing, the Fayette County has performed better than the national average in terms of that growth in those sectors, is really summarizing this data here.
And so if I'm correct, Andrew, like for utilities where it's the line, there, we see neither green nor red, that means we've just kept pace with the national average.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can see some of them. Yeah. With that one there, it's just so minimal. You don't really see it on either side of the spectrum in terms of that shift. Where, say, professional, scientific, and technical services, which of course is a very important industry, which is a lot of, innovative tech companies and all those types of industries in that sector, Fayette County surprisingly hasn't kept pace, even though you think of the educational institutions that are located in Fayette County with UK. It was actually surprising to actually see that between 2007 and 2017, we didn't see growth in that. So, a lot of people maybe in those industries are graduating from UK and maybe not staying within Fayette County and are moving to jobs elsewhere. Could be an assumption.
Well, it could also be the assumption that the national shift of that industry is just occurring outside of our region. That, like Silicon Valley and in Austin, Texas, and all the Research Triangle, they're all growing at a very rapid clip. That industry, it just isn't growing here, and therefore we're losing ground by shared purposes. Of course,
yeah, it's not comparing it to one singular place, it's the US average, but those the US average, of course, can be increased, of course, by Austin and Palo Alto and New York City and all these other areas. But generally, when you're comparing, it's not that it's not growing, but it's just growing at a slower pace than the US average by a pretty significant margin.
Andrew, it's Cynthia. What is included in educational services?
I would have to look into the actual details of the NAICS codes to provide that.
Because it could be that, excuse me, it could be that maybe some of the growth in Fayette County and Lexington, in terms of education is reflected, positively in that NAICS code category versus professional, scientific, and technical services.
Well, I know in terms of professional, scientific, and technical, that is a lot of private sector, tech innovation, consulting, all those types of services primarily go within the professional, scientific, and technical services.
Right. I'm just trying to explain the, educational services with the University of Kentucky. And I would think that growth in the educational services sector being green for this area is a big positive for the area.
That definitely is, yeah. As the university grows, more jobs are employed within the University of Kentucky and other educational institutions as well. So that's a big positive in terms of economic growth for Fayette County as well.
And is this a quantity of jobs, just like one job because when there's no waiting to, I guess, or is there any relevance to the fee or the revenue that the city generates from these various jobs as well? I mean, there might be some of these one that you're okay losing, if that.
Yeah.
And do we
Yeah.
tie those together, or how does that factor in?
We haven't calculated that out, but yes, obviously there are certain economic sectors here, or employment sectors that do have a higher weighting in terms of, say, like the GDP they bring to a local area, the number of secondary, tertiary jobs that they create. So, in terms of, say, like, one, say, like tech job may provide, a certain amount of, secondary, tertiary jobs to the area compared to, say, a job in manufacturing or construction. So they all have different variables attached to them in terms of their economic impacts to the region.
And as far as we are concerned, obviously, we're taking the direct revenue in a generalized ways to keep the proprietary, information or data of any particular employer, but we are taking the actual occupational license fees from people's salary, paychecks, as far as how we are using that in the fiscal analysis. So while this is like a higher level look at like, well, these are the industries that are trending up and down comparatively.
Yeah, I'm gonna go down and get set up down there.
The actual way we are using the data would be more aligned to trying to locate where the revenue is coming from. So obviously where there are more manufacturing employment, we would be getting those kind of revenue payroll data from that section. And to the degree that we increase in our scenario development, when we increase like industrial space, we would be increasing payroll, the occupational license fee revenue at the basis of what we're currently on the scale of what we're currently collecting in the city. So this would be more of a high level to understand where we're seeing growth in the economy, but it's not as direct as where we're actually collecting revenue.
Are there any further questions off of this? Doesn't seem like it, Mark. I guess back to you.
Sure.
Is it all right then if we move on to the next segment of our discussion items, the framework and evaluation matrix?
May I ask one follow-up question? And on page 78, the LFUCG revenue by land use type. And I guess I was just, curious the conclusions to draw from it relative to, I guess the success of parking structure land use and industry land use, and just, this is page 78, yeah. And just trying to understand where this and how this comes to be, and whether or not we shouldn't conclude that we should invest more in parking structures than hospitality sectors and things. I just wanted to expand on this a little bit more if we could.
Well, so this is again a direct relationship to where the city is receiving its revenue, and I think this is a little bit misleading in the sense that this parking structures was probably related to that was probably the predominant use of that land. However, there was probably some address / operational activity there that generates occupational license fees, and that's what is being reflected. So that's a good point. It is certainly not, as that graph shows, it's license fees that are being collected here, like occupational license fees. So we certainly aren't collecting that much money from the paychecks of parking lot attendants. So I'll go back and talk to Urban 3 and see if we can get a more representative description of that particular category and whether we need to like consolidate that with one of the other categories.
Yeah, if nothing else, we might just want to have a note or something on that one explaining why it's there, because I agree that one in particular is a little confusing.
Yes.
And it's a little confusing. It would be helpful if maybe we knew what year this was. I mean, is this 2019 data, 2018?
This is
revenue?
this is 2020. I'm 90% certain of that. I know that we got there's a chance that it's 2019, but I feel like we got the 2020 at the end of it all, and that's what we use.
Okay, it would be helpful to maybe title where all these come in, just because it's
Sure.
it would give it, I think, a little bit more substance. And then I guess it might be helpful because we go into expenditures, and I think we're meant to draw the conclusion of, well, we should invest in whatever type of land has more revenue than expenditures, and they don't necessarily correlate the same way. I guess I got lost on some of.
Well, yes.
Yes,
that's a good question. It's not that they should correlate. It's just simply saying that the city's revenue base is so skewed towards the occupational license fees that barring a change in how the city collects its revenue, i.e. like a reallocation of property taxes versus occupational license fees, the city will obviously receive more revenue from land uses that have payroll. Now, payroll can also be collected from residential homes. If someone works from home, they should be being, that's where they should be paying their employment tax there. But it was really to try to demonstrate that the city spends a lot of money on people throughout the county, but collects it on a land basis in very specific locations. And the notion is that as we allocate land for future development, we have to keep that in mind, that we will, in order to grow our revenue base, we need to have those types of land uses in the mix that actually the city, collects significant revenue from. And so it's not necessarily, the way I look at it is, it doesn't necessarily, not every house has to be revenue generating, or, overall comparative to cost, but it can't, obviously you can't just have one type of base that it is not generally not revenue generating in the same way that the higher end ones are.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's interesting that Price brought that up, because that graph shows only 1 year.
I'm sorry, I lost you.
Yeah, that graph shows only 1 year of data, and it's data from 2020. Wouldn't looking at a trend, a longer term trend, be more beneficial?
Yes, it is. That would be more beneficial. It would have to be collected. I don't know how far back we could get it. I mean, this was really difficult to go backwards, but I think going forwards, as we work on this, I work with the Department of Revenue on this, and regularly, I mean, their database is kind of locked up. And so one of the things that we had trouble getting even this data was just trying to limit the amount of, especially with the legal concerns about proprietary data. There was only so much we could bite off at this point.
Sure,
but going forward, you're right.
But 2020 was such an anomalous year with COVID. And I don't know if that's true in terms of, city revenues.
No. Well, I think you bring up a really good point. All of you do, but I think even if you went back in time, you'd see the land issue not changing too much. We just get too much revenue off. We're too heavy. If you ask me, do I want the law firm or do I want the shopping center? I want the law firm every day, because in terms of their influence and their profit to the city, if I'm just looking at that number, the higher occupational fee we get, the better the land use it just is. And if that's what we're looking at, that's the goal. And so this really wouldn't change. And we surprisingly had far better revenue last year than we expected. I mean, by tens of millions. I don't understand what's going on, except maybe it's a whole lot of extra money floating around. But regardless, the revenue actually was pretty stable and showed very much what's in this report. And I think the hard thing is, as you think about land use, is that mixed use is so important. And I think one of the things, Mark, that you made the point of, which is really important, is our tax structure does not benefit us long-term very well. We've continued not to get enough money from the way we're structured. We were $21 million short this year. We're going to be at least $20 million next year and continued, because our expenses of how we're using our city are just far exceeding our ways of collecting money. I mean, I would love to be a tourism city, and that's great, but the money does not help. Very little of it really helps us as a city, how we're funded. It helps the economy, but doesn't really help the city infrastructure move forward, if that makes sense. And tax reform is something that we have to have as a community, I would argue, and this exemplifies a lot of that. It just isn't sustainable the way we're structured, if that makes sense. I think, Mark, you make that point in here, honestly.
Thank you. I also, but to answer Ms. Press's question, or to follow up on that, I agree that in general, you won't see the proportion shift very much year to year, although you could definitely see some top line changes. And really what we're trying to do with this, and you definitely raise a good point, and it's something that I can go back and talk with Urban 3 about if we have the 2019 data, to just do some measurements to see how distinctly different they are. But what we're trying to do is set up, like, the basis for our scenarios going forward. Like if we were to develop out scenario 1 in one area as one land use, and in scenario 2 as another, what would that be the revenue return to the city in comparison? So yeah, we want to have the most accurate information. The goal is to have this data, readily available going forward for keeping this up to date, but obviously in a simple enough way that the city staff can maintain it.
To further that thought in this discussion a little bit, in table 7.1 here, we call out licenses and permits, and $318 million in there. Can we pull out permits from that number? Because I would suspect that the permit revenue coming from there is almost de minimis, and would probably really just amplify this challenge of the occupational license or the payroll tax. And,
sure.
And maybe that's also where I kind of struggle a little bit, is that most of this is the payroll tax, but we don't call it that. We call it an occupational license and put it in this bucket with permits. And so I don't know that it actually allows it to stand alone and build the case for tax return or tax reform, which I agree. And I'd compound that need for tax reform with also that there's more 1099 employees, more consulting, and the way that people generate revenue is different, to where it's not all coming off of a payroll tax. So I don't know if that's possible or feasible, but I do think we lose it within bucketing it like this.
Well, yes, I believe this came from the budget, and that's how they have it written. And I certainly don't mind just removing permits, but we would also probably want to justify, or just figure out reconcile what the permits part was, and maybe move that to a different line. But obviously it would be, I agree, a very insignificant amount of that total. Talking with the Department of Revenue, they are fairly serious about collecting from people that work from home and consult from home and stuff like that, more than I would have thought, just because they do have some checks to see where people, and on their income taxes and et cetera. And certainly if a company is paying, like an out-of-town company is paying somebody to work from home, they're paying attention to that. So that's good. I obviously can't speak to what reform or improvements could be done from my my limited conversations, but they do seem I can report that they are aware of that trend and recognize it as a benefit for Lexington, that if Lexington would seem to be a good place for the telecommuter transplant who wants to live here and work somewhere, work in Chicago or something. And obviously there's the opposite as well, but they understand that it's up to them to be able to collect those taxes.
Hey, Frank, could you put yours on mute, buddy?
And to that point, Mark, I think you see that play out in the single family land use, probably having a bigger proportionate share of the occupational license fee than one might expect. So clearly they are effective at it, but it's still, it's just hard the occupational license might just be the tech. I appreciate it's the terminology that we use, but you have to read that it is the payroll tax, without.
Right, good point. And I also think that if there is a hurdle that needs to be dealt with, it is smooth, making it easier to get the occupational license fee data by geographic area from the city, because that's just not what they care about. Like they don't care about where it is spatially. They just want the check, and they have the address and the tax ID number. And of course there's the fact that they're using a database that isn't particularly easy to customize your reports. But then the second aspect of this is obviously protecting people's proprietary information, which may explain some of the inability to capture all of the single family, all of that kind of payroll taxes that are collected at that level. And I think in one of our recommendations will definitely be trying to better coordinate that data transfer for this analysis to the best we can. This time was the first time they've tried. So I think we appreciated everybody's willingness to help. We appreciate, at first it didn't seem like they felt comfortable giving it to us at all. I think we demonstrated that it can be anonymized enough that it's not giving away anybody's particular information. But there's things that they definitely need to do to improve this, as we talked about before and in the report. They have to better geolocate everything instead of just using an address, because some of this stuff is coming into the city from out of the county, and we should be locating it where it is being generated as best we can. And I see no reason why with that intention that can't happen. I think before it just didn't matter, but it's something that we can improve on.
Just one more thought on that particular item. I think interestingly enough, regarding COVID of last year, we're getting more municipalities and other where people are traveling out to work. We're seeing more of them send checks in. And so what's interesting is that transportation Mark that you showed, we have a ton of people who I know work in Frankfurt from Lexington. And so you're seeing that not just from a transportation standpoint, but you're seeing that in the revenue numbers coming in. Because of COVID, more people are reporting back working outside of the county, which that's kind of a self-reported thing. And not everyone was, of course, doing that very well, but you're seeing more of that. So I think it'll be interesting this year to see, end of 2021, how that has changed. I think you'll see better data.
Definitely. I know from my paycheck, or our payroll, since we have offices throughout Kentucky, it really, no matter where I work, I have to, like, if I work in Franklin County for the day, I'm supposed to register that, and that goes to Franklin County. And I think if you would see the major employers like KYTC, for example, a big client of mine, if they go to that schedule, which a lot of our folks we're talking to is like a 3-2 schedule. If they're living in Fayette County, that should be money that goes to Fayette County. Any other comments?
Hey, Mark. It's
Hello.
Cynthia. I just wanted to let you know that I'm writing down all the comments and taking meticulous notes, so don't worry.
Okay, great.
Thank goodness for Cynthia.
You have no idea.
All right, should we proceed on to the other section then?
Sure. So we are still in the midst of getting a lot of this data organized for the scenarios. So I apologize. We're going to still be using more of the high level theoretical assumptions as opposed to hard numbers, but we're generally pretty clear on what is occurring. And we talked about evaluating scenario 2. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you what we've changed into the evaluation matrix. And I'm just going to show my spreadsheet as opposed to the putting it in a PowerPoint. So because I want to be able to change this stuff. But so this is the evaluation matrix, the point, where we would put the points and make our scores. Really quick, I'll just go, before I get into that, I'll just go through the process again of what we are trying to do generally. And that is, we've broken this up into basically 2 parts. One is it meeting capacity? Is our capacity capacity meeting the demand needs over a 20-year horizon, both for the upper and lower bounds of our demand projections, and then at the 75% level for that's what we've stated here. But that again is open for any type of adjustment. And then
Mark, before you proceed, can I ask a question about the thresholds that you've established? Is that all right?
Absolutely.
So it reads 75% of the high growth projected demand in 20 years for all land use categories. Is that in calculating that, are you taking the land use, the needs for housing, the needs for each of the other 3 categories and aggregating those?
No, they're separate. That's probably poorly worded. It's for each of those categories, are you meeting 75% of the high projection?
Okay, so I asked that question because what we know from experience is that something that may be at the moment categorized as industry may be recategorized as housing. When I was first on the Planning Commission, we were going in the other direction. We were going in the direction from taking industrial land and making it housing. Then we had a time when we needed more industrial land, and the zone changes we saw were the reverse. So I guess what I'm really asking is how do you get a number, and do you have to put all 4 of them together? And for this threshold, do you have to have enough for each of those categories separately?
You have to have enough for each of those categories separately based on the data the data that's on the ground today. So we would, if, for example, there was a zoning change and an ED land that was scheduled for industrial land was zoned to be something else, then that would come out of that inventory, right? So that would no longer be available for that capacity. Similarly, as anything gets developed, whatever, if it was in a category that has more flexibility, which is very common for a lot of the commercial categories, like you would have to make you would obviously catalog what the new development inventory is for that category, but also remove it from the opportunity for being used for something else. So it would be when they go to look at the parcel database and update the vacant data, the vacant parcels with the most up-to-date representation of either their zoning or their development. That is what would be used in the the numerator of that equation as far as capacity to demand is concerned.
Okay, and then in order to satisfy that threshold, all 4 of those categories would have to be able to meet the demand. If any one of them did not, then that scenario doesn't work. Is that correct?
That would imply that you should rework that scenario, suggest that that scenario does have I don't know if you want to use the term fatal flaw, but it has a significant issue that should, before you, determined whether you should go forward with it, maybe you consider what would be required to provide more capacity. So it's kind of an iterative process of why we say we start out with the baseline and assume that it's not going to, it's not going to necessarily meet those capacity standards at the baseline level. It may need some additional adjustments to the zoning, whether it's densities or rezoning. And then once you've established that, then you would proceed on to the next phase.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. However, I want to make a point though that one of the reasons why these things are broken up is into two phases is because it is relevant to suggest, at least especially for the baseline scenario, where doing nothing will get you. So it's not so much that you say like scenario one can't happen because it doesn't meet the capacity demands. If scenario one is the baseline, it could easily happen. Because if you don't do anything to change your trajectory, that is the implication is that is what could happen. So the idea of when they come to ask, do we have enough? Do we have the land necessary to meet our future economic and population growth needs? The planning staff analyst would be looking at the baseline scenario to start, but then suggesting, well, if we implement it, this gets us here. If we implement, these comp plan goals and priorities, this gets us here. But really, what we would have to do if we wanted to stay inside the urban service boundary limits as they currently exist would be to do this. And that's the idea, is to try to keep working at the scenarios so that the policymaker has an understanding of what would actually be required before, in order to maintain the current boundary. However, it also shows that the boundary may, for what may be required, the expansion may be a preferable option. It just depends on how today, I don't think that's an issue per se, like as far as the types of steps you'd need to take to stay within the urban service boundary for the foreseeable future. But in 10 years, those steps may be much more, strenuous on the remaining available land, and expansion by comparison would be better. So that's why we want to establish this, basic metric, this basic indicator of capacity to demand, so that people understand what's at stake if the baseline scenario doesn't change. So once we had with that first phase or threshold set, we move to the second phase, which starts to go through how this complies with the comp plan goals, how each scenario applies to the comp plan goals, with the goal of saying a scenario that we are targeting should be in compliance with those goals, and what would we need to do to improve it. So that gets us back to scenario 2 in our scoring system. So this is how we would, just to answer your question again, this is, we break this up into eight explicit questions. Does it have enough supply to meet the low end of the demand? Does it have to supply to meet 75% of the high end of the demand, both for residential units, office square footage, retail square footage, and industrial square footage? So in the case of scenario 2, scenario 2, again, just as a recap, is generally trying to be flexible with the available land we have from from the planning department side to allow for the kind of growth that would be necessary or essential to meet the growth demands, but it's not really heavy on the redevelopment of infill development, infill redevelopment. So it's a lot more of the changing of the zoning code, maybe more mixed uses on vacant parcels, etc. And we talked about some of the concepts before. So like in scenario 2, this purple property, the UK research farm remains intact, but the purple property now becomes more of a mixed use development as opposed to a singularly commercial development. And then in scenario 2 for the expansion area 3 doesn't really change in between scenario 1 and scenario 2 because its current zoning is, and the ED gives it some flexibility, but we assume in this particular case that it has the potential to provide up to 1.3 million square feet of industrial space, which is really what its best, the best option, or for Lexington would be if it does serve that market. And then, of course, in expansion area 1, scenario 2 implies that the Overbrook Farm parcel is upzoned from a low density single family to an R3 level density, but with a lot of mixed areas, so that it's not, so there's some areas that are more traditional single family dwelling units, but then some areas that are more high intensity, perhaps mixed use. So that gets us to the answering those questions. And again, what we see for scenario 2, with 38,000 housing units projected, new housing units projected, we easily meet the low projected demand, and we're well within the 75% range for residential units. However, here we see that even if the ED land in expansion area 3 is fully developed as industrial, we're still going to be short of 75% of the high growth demand, which 75% threshold would be 4.2 million square feet. So again, this is like one of the things that may change is as we go forward, the development of industrial space, particularly when the dairy farm comes online. If that space gets developed quickly, then this trend line will stay in this general vicinity. But if it doesn't, and it more reflects the development trend line from the last 10 years, then it'll go down, and potentially scenario 2, without even changing in 5 years, would be within 75%. So as of right now, scenario 2 does not meet that standard of enough industrial land of 75% of the high end, but it's still got significantly more than the low. It is more a reflection of how much how wide the range is for industrial. But to continue on through this chart, just to show clearly for office and retail, the scenario two, like all of these scenarios, both exceed the need for new residential office space available to it simply with what is currently included in the build out scenario. And even when you combine office and retail, you can see it's still healthy above those both each. So if we go back to our spreadsheet, you can see I've put ones in here or yeses to demonstrate that we meet all these thresholds with the exception of the last threshold of 75%. And so that would imply that this scenario does need to find more capacity for industrial land to meet that threshold. And it also, it begs the question, what are we comfortable with that threshold? Or is there something else we should be considering? And I still think this is a really important point to make, that the dairy farm will be real good leading indicator for how those trend lines look, because we see such a disparity in the 10-year versus 20-year trend line that I'd like to see some more data. And I think the dairy farm will kind of demonstrate that as providing some of those large tracts that the Commerce Lex says that are really the ones that are most marketable. Once those become available, will they, how quickly will they develop? Well, so then moving on.
I have
Sure.
a question.
Okay.
So what if we, we decide that maybe there's not enough industrial land to serve the 20-year horizon, but there is, vacant ED land sitting out in one of the expansion areas, but it's priced too high to be able to, entice an appropriate employer. Does that mean that we don't have the acreage? Or, how do we figure into our decisions the individual private property owners' choices regarding land value?
That's a good question. I would just make a point that currently the ED land available for development is included in this, and we're still low by that high standard. So the question is why? I mean, what is the ED land in expansion area 3 not selling because of its higher price, whether because of exactions or just its proximity within the county? That's a fair question to say. What role does our allocation of land for industrial space? How do we address that? But at the same time, even if it was to sell out tomorrow, it's it would still not necessarily, it's included in the inventory. So right now we're saying that I think it's more of a reflection of the demand curve on the high end being very high, but obviously still reflective of what has occurred in the last 20 years. So I don't know that I can answer that question. And I think it's a good question for your discussion, but for us, whether it's in an expansion area, whether it has an exaction program on it or not, whether, it's available for development, it's being marketed for development, it's in the inventory, and that's really where we stop trying to understand why it's not developing.
I think it would be tough to kind of bake in that level of complexity into this framework. That's not to say those policy questions and decisions shouldn't be discussed at the Planning Commission and council levels, but at least for the purposes of this framework, I think if we even tried to incorporate some of those questions, it would bog the analysis down, particularly on, as it's being updated on an annual basis. It would stall it to where it would probably take longer than it needs to actually complete the analysis.
I think there's some, go ahead.
I'm just going to say I totally agree with you. I think that would need to be taken up with the Planning Commission or the council or whoever. But property that's available is available. That's how we have to look at it.
I mean, I think when we write the report, we will note that, the exaction program does create, a competitive imbalance between given parcels, and even if it's just in the perception of the price of the land, but that ultimately what should really be a great indicator, because I do think there are conditions that Commerce Lexington has brought up about the availability of size parcels of a certain size, etc. The dairy farm will provide those ideal parcels, and it will not be affected by exactions, and it will, however, be priced for the market in which it's in, and I think that'll be a very good indication of how well or how much appetite we really have. And if there was a way to, we'll note that in the report. But I think that's going to be really the telling sign, is how quickly that develops. So moving forward, so in this,
Mark?
yes.
It's Don Robinson. I just have a comment. It strikes me, given the power that Lexington Fayette County is, it strikes me we're never going to be a sprawling industrial landmass community. That's really not our strength. I think that's sort of, we're not going to have that's just not going to happen here. So I think our industrial land will probably continue to be fairly expensive, but that's really that hasn't been our strength. That hasn't been where, it doesn't look like that's where the world's going, and certainly not for Lexington Fayette County. Our jobs seem to be tech, healthcare. We may be, I think we're laboring this point.
Yes.
That would be my point.
I mean, I think that this 75% threshold, one of the reasons why we have, we left it up for you all to, comment on, is whether it's appropriate. Maybe it's not appropriate for all categories. Maybe there's a conditional statement about we understanding that very soon we'll have this new parcel in the market that will be a much better indicator of the true demand, something like that. But
yes.
But if we establish a uniform 75% threshold at this level, it's close. It's about 60%, but it's not at 75%. And it still assumes that the ED land, again, that an expansion area 3 develops as industrial space as opposed to commercial space, something else. So
okay.
It's up to, I think it's a good question for the group to consider, whether they like that 75% threshold, whether they would say like because there's really no other, it's not like we have any other land zoned as industrial. So this is it. And this is, again, kind of gets back to my point about what's available inside the urban service boundary, and whether you prefer a lower threshold to suggest like a wait and see approach in particular, given the advancement of the dairy farm.
Thanks.
All right, moving on to the next phase, which is basically saying, well, maybe your scenario does meet 100% of its capacity needs, but how does it, before you say like, oh, we're all good with this scenario, like here's a chance to like see how it reflects against the comprehensive plan's goals and themes. So I've added the themes for which we've associated these questions from the comp plan, and we've changed the scoring, so it's now a 5-point scale on a scale of 0 to 4. So for example, the first question, does it prioritize high density development, which is one of the goals of the comp plan, the theme A, goal 1B. And we basically have provided 3 options. 1, no, it does not. 2, 0, it does not get, so it gets 0 points. 2 would be, it would make the urban service area slightly slightly more dense than the current zoning allows, or it makes it significantly more dense. So as you can see, if you change the points, we still have the weightings the same. We're asking, we're not, I'm not really making a judgment on what the weight should be. We made it fairly neutral for most, except for the 3 that we think are most important to us, but again, not really our call if we want to change these. But now we have this Likert scale, and basically the idea is, we will have real data. So for example, we will look at the current zoning in the developed density by zoning class and sub areas, so we can see what are the neighborhoods, where are the where the development is occurring. And again, this is a scenario 2 is a scenario that really is about developing vacant land that's not yet developed, but it's going to be in locations where there is development land. So we'll compare the densities by the different sub areas and by zoning class to see how our R3 in particular is a good example. Our R3 zoning density is different for scenario 2 versus scenario or versus the existing development, but even against, you know, the current zoning density development. And based on that, we can make a judgment of whether we think it does not prioritize density, only slight, or it doesn't do any increase in density, only slightly, or more significantly. And if there's some debate about that, if there's folks that you know, just somehow some would say it's slight, some say it's significant, or you know, some say it's none and some say it's only slight, you know, we have that an intermediary, like a point, so that people can compromise, but we still keep it relatively simple at a 5-point scale. So that's the big change from last week, is going from a binary yes no to a no pretty much, or a no some, you know, a no slightly and then significant is and then if there is, you know, significant discussion or need for consensus compromise, there's the, you know, some room in between.
Will you email this form out to the group?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So generally going through these, you know, prioritizing density, again, that we can do with our parcel database based on what we have in the build out scenarios plan for each parcel. Again, this is a build out scenario. So even in scenario 1, we're assuming that a vacant platted lot for R1D is available for development and can meet the development needs of the community. And so therefore, you know, it's programmed to be developed. That density is incorporated. But all of them are, all the scenarios have slightly different, for the undeveloped land, have slightly different densities. And so I'll just show you what we had for scenario 2. Oh no, I didn't shoot. See if I can find this real fast. Yeah, so we assume that for the, we assume we get some parcels out of actually, we assume all of these parcels are for, except the smallest lots are developed. And for R3 parcels, which currently in scenario 1, for example, are being developed at like a 11 units per acre, like an average between 10 and 12 is what the planning department told us. This bumps that up to 17 dwelling units per acre. And of course, R3 allows for mixed multifamily, a mix of multifamily and single family attached. So certain parcels can be developed, you know, with a variety of housing types and densities, but overall, the average would be 17. And then, you know, we have EA Overbrook Farm in this particular example, which currently it's agricultural residential, so it's very low density, would be zoned in more of a conventional, modern, typical R3 style development with lots of different housing densities inside of it. So back to our list. And so the next question, prioritize more diverse housing types compared to the proportion of housing types, single family, multifamily, and that can include, you know, like low density multifamily and high density multifamily, assumed in this scenario compared to the developed proportions by sub area. So again, we would be looking at how this compares to its surroundings as far as the diversity of housing types, and ultimately coming to the conclusion of whether we think it does slightly more or significantly more. And so I haven't changed the points here, but in this case, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's probably like a 3 because it's more than slightly, but probably not significantly more compared to what could be done everywhere. But again, that's open to the interpretation, like of whoever's doing the assessment. But I think I think we can definitely make a case that when you're going up to 17 units per acre on R3, which is the predominant vacant land use, that's a significant amount. And you'll have a significantly more amount of mixture of housing types because of that. And so then prioritize mixed use development. Some R3, it does allow some, commercial, small scale commercial uses. So that's likely to increase the mix a little bit, but not in this case. We're not really prioritizing the type of infill development where you'd see a lot of mixed uses. So we would keep this scale at, or the point answer at 2. Next question is,
Can we stop for 1 second?
Sure.
In regard to the last topic? It strikes me that one of the more subjective things that we're discussing in this is units per acre of 17. And as you just stated, it's up to whoever's doing the assessment. How does one deal with that over the long period of time? Let's say we all agree 17 is an acceptable number today. I mean, how do planners deal with this year after year after year? Because I mean, Jim Duncan, I believe in another meeting, said currently the goal for R3 is 12 units per acre.
Well, that's what they're currently seeing.
Okay.
So in scenario 2, so that's what's in scenario 1.
Correct.
So in scenario 2, we're increasing the density. So we're saying that it's even more than just what we're doing now. It's increasing it by a significant amount, but is it increasing it by like a maximum amount, or like that's where I think, I mean, so like, again, I would probably put this as a 3, just because it is doing it's significantly more than there is today. It's almost 50% greater for R3, for example. But would it be, I mean, yeah, I mean, to me, it's fair to say that it could be a 4, but we also know that it could be higher. So, that is a subjective question. And I think the real comparison will be at the time that you're doing the analysis. A lot of it does compare to what is currently being developed and what is zoned, what is its current zoning is, to demonstrate the significance of the difference. So if for example, like we are developing something in an area, like in the future, in an area that already is pretty high density, then this is, like that could be in scenario 1, it could still get a higher value because it's still a high density. But compared to what is going on today, that's where I think you definitely see, how do I put this? You would see the distinction from what you see today, and even in the future, if you're on the scenario 2 track, you should still see those kind of developments occurring that would imply that you're at a higher density, or you're prioritizing high density development.
Exactly. As we continue to evaluate this on an annual basis, or whatever time interval is appropriate, we'll be taking a look at the type of development that's coming in reaction to any sort of policy changes that are occurring. And it helps us, reevaluate on an annual basis, what we need to be doing to encourage the types of development we want to see in the community. So it's just one of the ways we can measure success. The other good news there, of course, is that it's just one of the criteria that we're looking at here. So it wouldn't by itself, give it a pass fail, if you will. So it's just one of the weighted criteria that's being considered.
And Mark, if I may, to answer Greg's comment, in the build out analysis, in talking to Jim Duncan, like you mentioned, the existing development pattern in R3 is really 10 to 12. So it's not 12 most of the time, it's more like 10, but we use the range of 10 to 12. And then the different scenarios, 2 and 3, I didn't assume 17 dwelling units to the acre on every R3 in scenario 2, and at 17 dwelling units to the acre, that's a 2,600 square foot lot, attached homes, townhomes. It's still, it's definitely not apartments. It doesn't have to be apartments, if you will. So it would just be smaller homes on smaller lots that are more affordable.
I think of this process as a math equation almost, where
It is.
where the planning commission needs to know what numbers went into the equation so they can understand the tool that's being presented to them.
Right.
As long as we give the planning commission that information for them to agree or disagree with, I'm happy.
Right. So for example, in scenario for number 10, like we would show, well, what is the proportion of, the development types or housing types in a sub area today versus what would be in there in the scenario in the future. And if the proportion is, slightly or significantly improved, then you get points for that. And it's based on the city as a whole. Obviously, we don't pick out one sub area, and that's the place it goes. But it definitely helps to consider where this development is actually occurring. That in areas that are basically built out, we're not expecting the development proportions to change dramatically, at least in scenario 2. But where development can occur, are we changing the pattern? Are we adding, like, if an area, like, say like the expansion area 2 that has a lot of single family detached houses. If in scenario 2, we suggest it's going to be more of a mix of single family attached and townhouses and apartment buildings, that proportion would, that we would see that change and say, like, that's what's significant about this proposal. And that's why we believe it's, a 3 out of 4.
Okay.
But it would be backed by the numbers, those proportions, that actual density number. So for 11, we already covered 11. 12, help Lexington provide safe, affordable, and accessible housing to the needs of older and disadvantaged residents. That includes, income, like low income residents. Here, we've made the basic premise that the best way to provide affordable units is to have more units available, and the more affordable side of units will likely be smaller in higher multifamily units. So, this again is just a comparison of the city as a whole to the total number of units your scenario can create, and then what percentage of those are you classifying or presuming to be multifamily. So it plays very much into the previous question 10 about the mix of housing types, but it is again a comparison to the the baseline scenario, which, yes, I'm sorry, my house is getting some work done on it, and so they're being very patient with me while we go through this. Anyway, so we would be basically making that comparison between what the current total units are, either both in the baseline scenario and the existing, so basically it's almost like a comparison to scenario 1, but how are we coming to meet the total amount of demand? Are the more the better, and then in each scenario, what percentage of that is multifamily? So that again is ties into previous questions. For accommodating off-campus student housing, here we've just established that it's really about the rental market, multifamily, or just new housing units in general, but generally there's going to be multifamily units within the 1 mile of campus. Obviously students can live farther away, but to really try to accommodate that market, and in particular to relieve pressure on the surrounding neighborhoods that students end up moving into those houses, or the existing houses. Does this scenario create new housing units within 1 mile off campus? And for scenario 2, which doesn't really emphasize infill development, we're only going to assume that it does that on a minimal amount level. So we're going to give it a 1, or actually in this case we give, yeah. I think I may have messed this up. Yep, I did. Well, anyway, it's a 0. I'll have to fix that later. And so that's for scenario 2. We wouldn't do too great in that score, but in theory, we would. I mean, it could be a 1 or a 0 in my opinion. And then for helping Lexington maximize development on vacant land inside the urban service area and the redevelopment of utilized land. Obviously, this again is related back to the density of the vacant land, that it's using it efficiently, that it's not, it's not wasting opportunities on the vacant side, but also does it take advantage of underutilized lands. In this case, it's a mixed bag because it definitely increases the density on vacant land, but it's not necessarily taking advantage of underutilized land. So that would be why it would get the score it gets here, which is basically, slightly, but again, that's why we have the scale. It's open to interpretation, whether it would be 2 or 3. I've put it at 2. The next question is similar. Does it help re-emphasize the redevelopment corridors of underutilized corridors? Again, I've kind of messed this up because it should be a 0. We haven't, in this scenario, we aren't really focused on these underutilized corridors, so we can't really give it credit for doing that. Does it help Lexington concentrate efforts to enhance mass transit along our corridor transit lines? Here, we are, again, not necessarily building off of transit lines, but we are increasing the density in areas that are served by transit on vacant land. So it does do it a little bit, but not a significant amount. And then finally, does it, or number 18, does it help prioritize multimodal options that de-emphasize single occupancy vehicle dependence? Again, because this is mainly focused on vacant land, where the location of the vacant land kind of matters. While it does increase densities, it could possibly increase the proportion of mixed uses. So at best, I would say it's possible to give it a 1, but it's not really doing anything to change the dynamic of Lexington as a auto-oriented development or city. And then finally is the urban 3 question. Does this have a positive impact on LFUCG finances? And we put that as a 2 because it does definitely, in comparison to at least the current development pattern and the scenario 1 development pattern, creates more opportunities for higher density property taxes, and also increases the likelihood of some mixed use commercial development. But it's not doing it in a significantly, it's not doing it in a radically different development pattern than previously. It's just more dense. So as you can see, based on this, if every question was answered with a 4, you could get up to 112 points based on the weighting of these questions. And we scored a 48. So that's 43%. So even scenario 2, according to this scoring, does not meet the threshold we set of 60%. And therefore, we would suggest that the principle of the framework would be to reconsider opportunities that, to pursue, like Imagine Lexington goals that could increase, compliance with the goals in the comp plan, and that would raise the score. So in this case, simply increasing densities alone doesn't really do too well on this side of the framework. You would also need to include more infill development in order to get that score to where you wanted it.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
What comments do we have amongst ourselves, this group?
Again, the things that we're most interested in, first of all, is the scale. I mean, my questions are, is the scale appropriate? Is the thresholds appropriate? Whether it's, the weighting or the actual threshold for saying satisfactory. We currently say 60%, but the weighting of any particular question and those are really, I mean, and then the 75% on the issue of high capacity would probably be the things that we'd really like to get some comment on.
Well, I'll jump in again if there's a pause. And if I can, I've got a couple of actually wording edits before I get to the
Sure.
details. If you go back to the evaluation framework purpose, and these comments are right along the lines of the ones that I made about the introduction. So up at purpose,
Oh, okay.
all the way up. Yeah, so right now it says the second bullet provides a transparent data-driven process for determining if USB expansion is necessary. I believe that really should read, I would suggest, it reads transparent data process for determining when consideration of expansion is necessary, rather than the data itself as being determinative. And if you go down to the next frame, same change of language in number 3, determine if and when consideration of expansion is necessary. And then kind of going down to the framework, if I understand correctly, next slide down. If I understand correctly, the rubber does not meet the road until we get to basically scenario 3, where we determine if we have a scenario that in fact, by our best projections, will meet the need for demand in all 4 categories. And that's when the question becomes, okay, the data tells us that we don't have enough, as given the framework we devised. Does that mean that we need to proceed? So then the next question becomes what you've run us through, the evaluation framework. I did a quick and dirty analysis down in this. If you can go down to the scenarios again at the bottom.
Oh, the questions or the?
There's this, yeah, the questions, yes.
Okay.
So again, I think that's a set of very complex questions. And the way in which they are weighted and the threshold is really what's going to make more difference than anything else when we get to a scenario 3, a place where we believe that the existing scenario, which is the most aggressive, is still not adequate. And so I'm not, I think it needs a lot more kind of conversation. If you made me king instead of vice mayor, I would do two things. One, I would change the base to on the weights to 1 rather than 2, so that there's more flexibility with the actual weighting. And then I have my own notes about then the weights that I would assign. But I'm pretty sure that the weights I would assign, if I ran them down for you, that not everybody in this group would say, "Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly how we ought to weight them." And this will make a difference. And a part of the reason I asked last time for kind of running through was that when we get to the bottom line, the question of what percentage of response to these questions is actually going then to be an additional trigger. I think that's the key. So I guess what I'm saying is I'd like to see a lot more conversation, and there are ways that we could ask, do a group process and get individuals' sense of how they would weight those. But I think that's a set of questions that needs more conversation. So thank you.
Sure.
I concur with the Vice Mayor that we need a lot more conversation in regard to the weighting. And honestly, I'm going to need more time to. I'm on a small screen, so it's hard for me to provide a lot of input.
Okay, so yeah, absolutely, we can definitely. I'll send this out this afternoon, so you can work with the spreadsheet, and then. Obviously, if you have the spreadsheet, you can play around with it to see like what triggers a passing score based on your various weightings and the way you would answer the questions. I do think that's probably the most practical way to give you guys enough comfort level with how it could work and what you would recommend as far as the weights. As far as the scale goes, that Vice Mayor Kay, that was in response to your suggestion. Is everybody generally amenable to that 5-point scale?
Yes,
I think so. Mark, I had excuse me. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
John Robinson, sorry. I thought, and I don't blame you, but there was sort of a short shift on infill and redevelopment. You just sort of brushed that off, that these tables did not account for that. Is that what I heard?
In scenario 2, most of the development build out development occurs on vacant land.
Right. I understand. Okay.
Now vacant land can include, plotted parcels within relatively built out areas. So that's a form of infill, but it's not addressing the style of infill that and the comp plan I think is referring to when
that was my point. That was my point. This is policy of the last comp plan, and we're not there yet, and we probably haven't developed a number of tools that could make it more doable and amenable, but it's certainly a pretty serious tool that the community has adopted to the way we grow. So I don't want to throw that out. The other, if I could, while I have the mic, I'd also like to back up to sort of the evaluation framework purpose, the first slide. And Vice Mayor Kay, I think I would agree with him. I certainly agree with his text changes. The first title, I think, is deceptive because I understand what you're saying, but I think it's deceptive in that it says we need to maintain and expand the urban service boundary outside the comprehensive plan process. I think that's misleading because this trigger, whatever we're doing, this framework will lead to a comp plan process. This will feed into a comp plan process. So it's not, I understand that the calculation is outside the comp plan process, but it will have to go to the comp plan process to whether we expand or not expand. That will, I think that needs to be clarified. That's my point.
Yeah, and I agree that it needs to be clarified. Craig, did we want to ask?
Yeah, is there, I mean, would it be acceptable to put something like it's consistent with, but independent from the comprehensive plan process? I just don't want to create the appearance that we're doing a full plan update every year.
No, I understand that. But basically, if you do that, you're having no expansion. You're just evaluating your uses of your land uses, but you're not expanding outside the comp plan process. That's my only point. And I think it sort of indicates, yeah, we're having an expansion.
That's the question. I do have that question. Like, it sounds to me like you are saying the only mechanism for expansion of the urban service boundary is through a formal comprehensive planning, like amendment, but is it necessarily like updating the entire comprehensive plan, or is it just, or I mean, can it occur if the comprehensive?
In order to have an expansion, you're going to have to go through comp plan. You don't just have a willy-nilly expansion outside the comp plan. Is that?
I'm asking like this is where I don't. I mean, just to be clear, like, can you amend the comp plan without formally like redoing the comp plan? I mean, is there an amendment process that it doesn't have to occur every 5 years?
If I can weigh in, and Councilmember Bledsoe shaking her head also, the answer to that is yes. At any point, it's possible to amend the comp plan, and in fact, that happens with small area plans. And perhaps,
correct,
given that, the language needs to be something like to inform the comprehensive planning process. So it does not mean that you have to tie this to a comp plan, total revision. It can be an amendment, but it needs to be tied to the comprehensive planning, to the comprehensive plan. If not the comprehensive planning process, because the comprehensive planning process really refers to the 2 years of work that goes into revisions, that then goes to the planning commission and the council and so on and so on. And I would not want to rule out a process that would amend the comp plan, but the comp plan is the final word. So maybe it's
Support. Give
well,
information.
for determining, maybe there needs to be more detail. If an amendment to the comp plan should be considered, or
Okay.
if information should be used as part of the comp plan process, or maybe two options. Does that make sense? I mean,
somewhat.
well, that's better than not at all.
To
Okay.
me, what we are doing is we are putting a process in place to help the planning commission with their decisions. Is that not what we're trying to do here?
Correct. And I think the biggest question is whether this, the degree to which this is independent from the formal comprehensive planning process that generates a new comp plan every 5 years. In that sense, that's really where I was trying to,
Okay.
target this language.
Let me make another suggestion, see if I get better than somewhat. So evaluation framework provides a transparent, data-driven process for determining whether consideration of expansion is necessary, whether consideration of expansion should be considered as an amendment to the comprehensive plan or as part of the comprehensive planning update, the comprehensive plan update.
I think that makes more sense. I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think part of this conversation was so that it wasn't an every 5-year conversation. People
Right.
are waiting 5 years for this. They're not
Right.
waiting 5 years for land. They're not waiting 5 years for decisions. We need an opportunity to have a different decision point. And so I think that's closer to what the council, at least I believe, feels. Whether or not
But
reflects else, I don't know.
But
What
Also,
concern,
Council-
excuse me, Ann, I'm sorry. I just want to clarify why I made, we're getting into this discussion. I would hate to see an expansion are we talking about an expansion every year? Because we think we need an expansion each year?
That's not the way I would interpret it, the process. I would
Yeah.
interpret it as like going to the doctor and getting a physical, and you only get surgery when you need it. Like you're finding out like where you are, but you don't necessarily change anything. And I think that's kind of where this part comes in, is like whether consideration is required. Like if it's not required, you don't do anything.
Yeah, it gives us a true annual look at what
Right.
the needs are and what the projections are, how much vacant land is still available. for
Okay, I get that.
We're looking at, and it really, to the extent of the initial charge of the task force, it allows that comprehensive planning, the comprehensive update that happens every 5 years. It allows this, while this question is always going to be part of that process, it's not going to be the predominant part of that process. It allows other focuses during the comp plan update process, and it allows this particular issue to be evaluated on a more regular basis.
We can't answer your question, Don. Only the council can answer that question.
Yeah, I get that. Understand.
But yes, and so in the best of all possible worlds, we will have broad agreement about the initial data and the way to evaluate it, and we'll do an evaluation of the possible scenarios. And that will give us a baseline. And it may be that when we go through all of that, it becomes clear that for the moment, we don't have to, we need an aggressive scenario, but that will be adequate for X amount of years. Now you want to keep updating the data, but you don't want to keep raising the question of, are we pulling the trigger?
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Gotcha. Okay. I'll lower my hand.
I've got another question, if I may. I understand the scenarios that we have created, but in the future, what's the baseline for these scenarios? Have we written that yet? Where is that baseline of what these scenarios are to be?
Well, it is our recommendation, just going through this process, and obviously I appreciate everyone's forbearance that we are learning how to do this along with you guys, and that's part of the thing, right? Is to get the ideas that work and understand what might work best in the future. And in that sense, we do believe the baseline should be with a current parcel level database of what's developed and a current zoning build out scenario based on what could possibly be developed with the current zoning. That should be your scenario 1 baseline, so that you can answer those first questions pretty factually without a lot of interpretation of what they mean. It's a matter of square footage and dwelling units.
So scenario 1 is always existing conditions. Am I interpreting that correctly, Mark?
Correct. The existing zoning as built out, and then the next scenarios are really, we went through this particular iteration of saying, well, what if you just press the density button a couple times? And then the third scenario was, well, getting the density doesn't really address the comp plan. It's not a surprise. But, in the future, if you've already amended your comp plan and you have several, of these themes kind of now as a part of the baseline, maybe just increasing density alone, you will do better. But assuming you haven't done some of the more aggressive things, it would, again, require you to, maybe consider those before you say there's no other alternative. And I think, Cynthia, you have your hand raised.
I was just going to add on to that, Mark, that, in scenario one, just think of it in terms of development as allowable by the existing zoning ordinance and development standards. Okay, so if every parcel that's vacant today were developed in accordance with allowable zoning and existing development standards, this is the number of units and approximate square footage that you would have after they were all built up. Scenario two, assumes a slightly higher development density, particularly in R3. It also assumes more residential and mixed use development in other non-residential zones. So the types of development that's proposed and espoused and promoted in the comp plan is considered in those other land use classifications like commercial, et cetera. And then in scenario three, we've really taken a hard look at all of the redevelopment areas and commercial corridors, as well as, more mixed use and more intensification of residential development. So in a perfect world, scenario two would get you where you really want to be from a standpoint of still loving your community and allowing for a broader cross-section of development across other types of zoning classifications. Does that help?
It does help. And I understand how we establish scenarios 1, 2, and 3. I'm most interested in how in the future these scenarios are going to be established, because we're quickly moving away from scenario 1 with the comprehensive plan, and scenario 2 is going to become our scenario 1 in a very short period of time, in my opinion. And then maybe we just have 2 scenarios.
Correct.
Future.
Absolutely.
That's possible.
Who decides that? Who dictates that?
Well, I think, Greg, the tool and the reason why, we went to the parcel level, it's because it's what I understand best. And I think it's what's the most appropriate way to best understand what your capacity is to accommodate future growth, as well as future development in non-residential uses. But by handing this over to the city as a nice package, if you will, the city can monitor development. And that's the whole point. When a city takes the data collection process seriously and has a very in-depth analysis of what they have today, what the future is, what the potential is with what they have today with vacant land, they can then build onto what we've created for them and monitor how the city is doing. So for every parcel that comes in, and let's say it's a vacant parcel today and it has a zoning of R3, they can look at a parcel level what we assumed would happen and what actually does happen. And so they can build onto that information and know year over year how they are tracking with the amount of development that the city can accommodate as it compares to reality versus the crystal ball that Cynthia Albright applied to each parcel using their adopted zoning. So if they are serious about making sure that the urban service boundary isn't expanded until it absolutely needs to be, they need to monitor at a parcel level what happens on that vacant land and constantly compare that and report it back at the end of the year as development continues year over year.
So the scenarios that you've described are fixed over a long period of time.
It's not fixed as much as it's a guide. And so with the information that we've created in a format that the city understands how to use, they can track and monitor development patterns by areas, by parcel, and they can say, for the example, if they get 150 developments and they're adding that information into the geodatabase that we're providing to them, they can see how they are tracking with respect to the number of units, the type of units, mixed development, redevelopment of underutilized parcels, whatever the case might be. They can then begin to analyze how they are tracking. The scenarios is just a guide, scenario one being a natural interpretation of the allowable development patterns by zoning. Scenario two is also they're all very reasonable. And at the end of the day, if they're seeing a lot more development in a specific type, let's say they're seeing a lot of development that accommodates like scenario three, where they're seeing a lot of attached townhome products at more than 17 dwelling units to the acre. Well, if they track all that, then they'll know how they're doing. And that's what the scenarios are. It's really a guide to understand the types of development, the types of density that result in a certain number of housing units and a certain amount of developed acreage by non-residential zoning classes. So they're not concrete as much as they're guides to give the planning staff an idea of how they're growing, how they're accommodating demand, and whether or not, 5 years out, they need to be considering a discussion of expanding the urban services boundary, because for all we know, development in the city just goes gangbusters and all the vacant land gets consumed in a much shorter time period than anticipated.
So are we going to document this guide of these different?
Oh,
versions?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm
And it is documented. And that's why that's the value of it, is every row on every parcel has all three assumptions in it. Scenario 1, 2, and 3, every row for all 96,000 parcels is documented.
Okay.
I mean, it's a huge effort, but it's what the city needs in order to be able to track and understand and compare how they're growing with each of these scenarios. And all of this will be given to the city.
So is it fair to say that if this all works as described, that what it will enable our staff to do is on an annual basis, or perhaps more frequently, whenever they need to, they will be able to adjust the projected growth. So right now we've got these straight lines that go from today to 40 years out, 20 years out. That line right now is based on the data we've got. As the data changes, that line can shift down, that line can shift up, and that's really what we need to be monitoring.
That's right. And,
Okay.
and I've shared all this with Jim Duncan, and his staff certainly knows and understands clearly how I've come to the conclusions I've come to. And it's then incumbent upon their staff to utilize this information to the best of their ability to be able to monitor how they are growing at a parcel by parcel level and report back to the Planning Commission and Council.
I just wanted to mention, so this is the database. It's the parcel level database, and I know you can't read it, but like for each scenario, these are the development assumptions for every parcel and every vacant parcel in the city.
You're not sharing your screen right now, Mark. I'm not
Well, no wonder you can't read it. I was wondering why nobody was complaining about like, why did we put the spreadsheet up here? But this is what Cynthia is speaking about, specifically about how we document each assumption. And obviously we're not going to read it, but as you can see, like various, there's a lot of similar language for similar types of parcels. And in theory, back to Greg's kind of question, well, do you just keep this, or do you, as the second scenario, can it be different? Sure it can. Like in a few years, if they said, like, you know what, like we want to measure, like we don't think 17 units per acre for R3 property and in expansion area 2 is really like what we want. We want to do something a little bit different. They could change those assumptions and run that scenario and get different numbers coming out of it, right? However, when we developed these scenarios, and I think Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong, that are, you know, what kind of guided us to the where we landed on them was to kind of create these basic guide points so that they don't have to like reinvent the wheel of what the scenario process has to be. In the future, like if they were to do this next year, really to me, like the next big data points won't necessarily be the new development. It'll be the new census data.
Correct.
Right. So like in the future, they could just run these scenarios with the appropriate, you know, changes that need to be made for new development. But they could run these scenarios with the new demand curves and see how, you know, they match up on that top line of, you know, percentages to development. Like, because for all we know, we get the new census data and it says, oh, you don't need 41,000 new households. That's not what's the expected. It's going to be more like 35. Well, then suddenly a lot of these scenarios, in theory, you could say, well, we maybe we don't need to be as aggressive to meet all these standards, you know, something like that. But you know, that's kind of where I see it happening next time. But 10 years from now, assuming you've made really good progress on your land planning and gotten the kind of development you wanted, you may find that you don't need to run a scenario 3 as much, because all you really have to do is, you know, tweak some of the densities on your remaining vacant land to meet that demand curve. Now, what really is going to happen, though, of course, is you're not going to just be settled on 2040 as your ultimate end goal. It's constantly going to be moving out, and you're not creating any new vacant land inside the urban service boundary. So most likely, scenario 3 will be required just to meet the next generation of demand. And that's where this framework becomes more relevant for, you know, the expansion question, is because, yes, it does not look like the need to expand or we have to expand the boundary today is going to be reflected in our capacity to demand as of today for the next 20 years. But even if, like, whether the economy does really well or just, you know, enough time goes by, you still may do a lot of aggressive things and still need to expand, right? So this will tell you that, and it can show you that in scenario 1, and then you could try to just increase density. That doesn't do the trick. You know, try some more aggressive approaches. We're not suggesting what you put in each one of those scenarios so much as that's the progression that we've used in our thinking for how to meet the demand for the next 20 years today when we did it now.
I appreciate that, Mark. I mean, what I'm taking from this and was the answer to my question, and my concern was, is it easily repeatable? And your answer is yes. And then are we going to be able to document to the Planning Commission and to the council during this process what information went into this for them to understand how the answer was derived?
Yes, absolutely.
I had a question too. If this is going to be continually an updated process where the goalpost continues to move through time, right? And we're going to have to weigh costs against revenues. But what about, I mean, there are some costs that weren't included in the analysis, and that's the cost of providing additional sewer service, the cost of building new schools. And these are, you know, costs that we've experienced. We pay a $35 bill for stormwater control right now that were a result of existing development, yet those costs are not incorporated into the existing conditions analysis. Do we anticipate that when we get to a threshold point that we will have to undertake that kind of cost-benefit analysis?
I think it's a fair question. I think the question that we've confronted, right, on the question of like infrastructure, developing infrastructure. First of all, you know, the infrastructure, like as with the exactions program, typically you can't have development without the appropriate infrastructure in place, and that ends up in some form or fashion being actual construction of the infrastructure is priced into the development, right? So, and as far as schools and other public services, again, those are a planning process outside of obviously the planning department's land, the comprehensive plan land price. And it seems to me to beg a bigger question of how big you want Lexington to be total growth wise. And that's not where we have made any type of policy, position. We are simply monitoring the trends and suggesting what the appropriate amount of land necessary would be to support that growth. If the goal was to not have growth, then that's a policy discussion for folks to have, but it's not one I'm going to wade in on in particular. But in general, when we talk about infrastructure, one of the issues that you have to recognize and is that it's not just the construction, it's the operations and the maintenance and the replacement of the time. And that is that is something that in a generalized fashion we can do with the Urban 3 kind of work, where they definitely take that into consideration in their O&M costs of infrastructure on a very large, on a widespread basis, not on a particular basis. And I think we do that. First of all, we do that because it is highly complex to try to figure out what the cost of replacing urban infrastructure for 100 years, that's 100 years old in an urban place. It's block by block. It's building by building. So again, we're not going to do that every time. We're trying to figure out, is infill better or greenfield better? And it also gets to the point that Charlie Martin from the Public Works Department explained. It's like, you're going to have an infrastructure replacement plan, whether you expand the urban service boundary or not, period. So in some senses, what we can do with the Urban 3 part is show that the high return property, the ones that use the infrastructure that the new infrastructure you put in place the most efficiently, will look better than land uses that suggest
the lower return money. Yeah,
right.
higher cost to the city.
And that's probably as far as we can go, trying to evaluate how infrastructure costs over time are reflected in people's preferences for, like you mentioned the sewer remediation plan and the cost of that. That had, yes, that had something to do with the development, the land development of the city over time, but it also just had to do with this, the age of the infrastructure over time. Not necessarily, and these are just things that the city's going to have. They're not necessarily tied expressly to the question of expansion.
But I do feel like.
Well, but we're.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Go ahead, Ann. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say.
Well, I was just going to say,
Go ahead. Go girl.
Well, we use whatever, thank you. We use 60% of Jessamine County sewer capacity in the Brandon Crossing plant. What is the cost going to be when we need to build a third sewer plant? And so, I'm not sure what those forecasts look like. I know that they're not built into that existing trends report.
Right, and that we tried. We thought about doing that. We talked to. The problem is it's a per person capacity at the treatment level. So whether you whether you flush your toilet on the third floor or the first floor, it's the amount of times you flush your toilet. And so we can't really, the capacity issue is going to be tied to the person, number of people living here. There's a lot of infrastructure questions and costs. Again, if you spread it out, you have more infrastructure to maintain. I would, that we can kind of deal with, but the question of at what threshold you will need to build a third treatment plant. Well, if you talk to, if I talk to people in my office, they say it's roughly the equivalent of adding the amount of people we're going to add by 2040. Right. So whether we spread them out or don't spread them out, we're going to need to address that question in 20 years. But it doesn't necessarily get tied to whether you need to expand or not. And that's why we left it out, because there's just, there's certainly no way we can cost a third treatment plant into the evaluation of this in what we're doing today. Now, that's
Yeah.
not to say that over time, is that because it gets closer to coming to fruition and people saying it's going to happen, and what, depending on where our development pattern is taking us, whether it should be on the north side or the south side or the west side, that's all, I mean,
Yeah.
that's all fine to be added. And, if I can
Yeah.
put a pin on it, like the goal of the framework is the idea of using the scale, the idea of like the weights, the idea of the questions. Other questions can be added and other data points can be considered like relevant to be included in the future.
So yeah,
but for
you're thinking that kind of analysis will take on a different study. When the time comes, it'll be time to undertake a study, let's say to build a new landfill or to,
Correct.
pair out the
Right.
costs of, okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure.
What I was going to say, that piece of it, I think, will be a piece that needs to be studied. If there is an expansion, a group needs to look at how the best piece of land to do it economically for the city. I think that needs to be somebody else's concern, not ours.
I
We'll
think
leave
that'll
that to
end up-
Vice Mayor.
I think that'll end up being a recommendation that,
Yeah,
we say
absolutely.
that, our expansion, when expansion is necessary, it should be explicitly to meet the demands of, meet the unmet demand, and it has to be somehow like stipulated how that occurs. But again, yeah, it's a second policy question.
Right. And the only other thing that I want to make sure of, the point that Don brought up earlier about the infill parcels, I want to make sure that they are seen as important as the other available pieces of land that have not had anything, built on them. So I just want to make sure that has the same weight.
Well, no, that's the point though, is that in scenario 2, you don't get points for what you don't do.
Right.
It doesn't do well. And in scenario 3, where we try to do that kind of work, or we assume that work gets done, then you get points for that. And so you can't claim that this is the best we can do if you didn't do some of the things you could have done.
Right.
So that's
Okay.
the idea, is like we want to have enough flexibility in the scale so that every score doesn't come out the same. And yet we want to make sure that it's not so widely dependent on a single variable.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
It's 3:04. What other comments do we have amongst our group? And I do think I think it important that we invite the few attendees we have left to make public comments, since they weren't able to last time. So, and then I'll remind everybody that we do have a meeting on June the 23rd at 1 that will be furthering this discussion. Any other comments amongst this group? Frank,
Frank is trying to get unmuted. Still can't hear you,
Frank,
Frank.
we're still, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Gotcha.
All right. There's no common denominator. You can analyze till you paralyze. And this decision is not going to be based just on analyzation. What it's going to be based on is the fact that when the time comes to expand, the faith in the planning commission, the faith in the staff of the planning commission, and the faith in the people on the council are going to drive this. And it's not one of these willy-nilly things that you're going to jump up and say, oh, we got to expand, we got to do it the next year. It's going to take 3 to 4 year process to expand. And if you keep it on the comp plan track, and let's say you do a comp plan, this coming one, and let's say you say, well, the next one, we're going to have to consider expansion. Well, in that 4 to 5 years is when you start planning for that expansion. And you have to plan for it. We wouldn't be in the problems we're in right now with the consent decree if we'd planned for that expansion. But we didn't. We just put the exaction fees in and hoped it would cover it. Well, we kicked it down the bowl and we wound up with a consent decree. So hopefully we've learned that lesson. So I really have problems with the idea that just anytime the council or some group wants to expand, they just vote, we want to expand and let's look at it in the next year or two, because expansion shouldn't happen that way. Expansion should happen through a planning process that goes over at least one comp plan out. And this data.
I agree, Frank. I was going to say, I think that any kind of expansion needs to be data driven, and that's what we're doing, is we're providing that metric, that rubric, so that any kind of expansion plans for the future are driven by information, by metrics that we can see exactly where we're at.
But Lynn, if you triggered it today, you need to plan for it at least 4 years out. Because it's going to take that long to get where you need to expand and how you need to expand. And it has to be part of a comp plan process, because you can't go back and repeat that just because the council decided to vote for it, or the planning commission decided to do it, or a group of citizens decide to do it. It has to be a process. And with these analyzations that we're doing now, this triggers are supposed to help us get this in the right process to know when we're going to expand and how we're going to expand.
Agreed. Hopefully we're providing a tool to predict.
And that's right. That's exactly what we're doing.
Councilperson Bledsoe, you had your hand up for a second, or not?
Well, Mr. Penn, I have the best respect for you and respect for your opinion on this. And I think that's why Vice Mayor Kay and I have been involved, is that we don't want it to be a willy-nilly process, and we don't want it to be something that's done at the will. But I'll tell you, not everyone shares that opinion on council, and they're willing to kind of move forward more quickly than maybe others would like. And so that's why, whether we agree with that or not, that's kind of
the
point of what I'm trying to say, I guess, lightly, is we want this to be helpful and data driven, and we want it to be something that, so it's not willy-nilly of who's on there and who wants to vote just because they can.
Do you want another $800 million consent decree, or do you want to do it right?
No, sir, I don't. But I'm just saying there are others on that group who would be rather a little more aggressive right now. And I think that's what I'm feeling, and I think that's what Councilman said.
Amanda, I hear what you're saying, but I'm telling you, if we don't learn from the past, if we don't do things right this next time around, shame on us. And so all I can tell you is the process is there to do it. You either follow it or you don't follow it, and you don't follow it at your own peril.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Councilperson Bledsoe. If we could, let's move on to, are there any attendee comments? Could they raise your hand if you would like to have a question? I don't see any hands raised. Do you, Craig?
No, sir. No hands raised.
Our next meeting is June the 23rd at 1 p.m. And shortly, Mark's going to email that document out so we can get our thoughts around the framework a little better. And then beyond that, have we formalized July the 12th at 6 p.m., Craig, or is that still in play?
I have that on the schedule at this point. We haven't, it hasn't been formalized, but that's what we're moving toward at this point, is that the community meeting would be July 12th at 6 p.m.
Right. And then
Is that Zoom? Is that a Zoom?
I think that's the way we'd like to proceed on that, just to provide the most opportunity for participation on that.
Okay.
Craig, what up? Did you have any other items that you wanted to discuss?
Only that your July meeting after that community meeting is set for July 21st. So I don't know that it's appropriate at this time to set another meeting, but depending on the results of next week's meeting, I'm glad to put some alternatives together for you to meet between next week and July 21st to try to keep moving towards the ultimate.
I agree with you. We probably ought to see how next week turns out.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
See if Frank and Councilperson Bledsoe can get along.
Oh, we don't fall out. We're just different opinions.
Just playing with you, Frank.
Always dangerous when someone starts their comments with, "I have the greatest respect for you."
Yeah, that's what brings me to that. You're always worried about the butt.
Hey, I bought my girl that horse at your wisdom and experience, so I listened to you.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. That'll be an ongoing expense for sure.
It is.
Is there a motion to adjourn if there's no further comment?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much.
you.
Appreciate it. We're getting there. We are getting there.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you
are.
all. Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.